You have asked God why He has not answered. Not out loud, not in a way you would admit to most people, but the question is there, every time you pray and nothing moves. This message answers it directly, and the answer will change everything about how you pray from this moment forward. There is a prayer you have been carrying that has not yet been answered, not a small prayer, not a casual request that you have already moved past. A real prayer, one that cost you something to formulate, one that has lived in you long enough to have become part of the furniture of your interior life, one that you have brought before God with sincerity and persistence and a faith that has been tested by the very silence it has received in return. And that silence, that specific and prolonged and inexplicable silence from a God you know is capable of answering, is one of the most quietly painful experiences that the spiritual life can produce. But here is what that silence is not. It is not evidence that God did not hear you. It is not evidence that your prayer was insufficient, or your faith was inadequate, or your relationship with God has a deficiency that is blocking the response. It is not evidence that the thing you asked for was wrong, or too large, or outside the scope of what God is willing to do in your life. And it is not evidence that God is indifferent to what you carry. The silence of God in response to a sincere and persistent prayer is never any of these things. It is something else entirely. And understanding what it actually is changes everything about how you carry the unanswered prayer and what you do with the silence that surrounds it. Your enemies, the ones who have watched your life and drawn conclusions from what they could see on the surface, have interpreted your unanswered prayers as evidence of your spiritual insufficiency, as proof that God does not respond to you the way He responds to others, as confirmation that something in your relationship with God is blocked in a way that prevents the kind of favor they have observed flowing in other lives. And those conclusions, spoken or unspoken, observed or imagined, have added a layer of weight to the silence that you were already carrying. The weight of being seen as someone whose prayers do not move heaven, someone for whom God seems slow to respond. They were wrong. They were looking at the wrong dimension of what was happening, because the unanswered prayer is not the sign of a God who does not respond. It is the sign of a God who is building something in the silence that the premature answer would have prevented. And what He is building in the space between your prayer and its manifestation is something your enemies cannot see, cannot touch, cannot interfere with, because it is being built in a dimension that is entirely outside their jurisdiction. Chosen. I am speaking directly to you who are watching this video at this exact moment in your life, to you who know the specific weight of a prayer that has lived in you long enough to have become a permanent resident of your interior life without ever having received a visible response. To you who have continued to pray and to believe and to carry the expectation with everything you have, even when the silence seemed to stretch beyond what faith alone could explain. This message exists to give you the only interpretation of your unanswered prayers that can transform the way you carry them. The silence is not God's rejection of your prayer. It is God's protection of what your prayer is building toward. Let me describe with precision what living with an unanswered prayer for an extended period does to a person from the inside. Not from a comfortable theological distance from the real place where the weight of that silence lives. The first thing it does is create a progressive shift in the way you approach prayer itself. Before the extended silence, before you had enough experience with unanswered prayer to have your approach shaped by it, there was a certain openness in the way you prayed, a natural expectancy, a relatively uncomplicated connection between asking and receiving that gave prayer a quality of genuine dialogue. You brought what you needed. You believed God heard. You expected a response in some form. And that expectancy was not naive. It was the natural posture of someone whose relationship with God had not yet been tested by prolonged silence. After the extended silence, after enough time has passed without visible response to the specific prayer that matters most, that openness begins to change in ways you cannot always name in the moment. The prayer continues. For most people in this situation, it never fully stops, but it changes in texture. In the quality of the expectancy it carries, there is a subtle guardedness that develops. a careful distance between the words of the prayer and the full weight of what the prayer is really asking for. As if something in you has learned to protect itself from the full impact of an unanswered request by not fully committing to the expectation of the answer. You still pray, but with a part of you holding back, invested enough to keep praying, guarded enough to manage the disappointment if nothing moves again. There is also something that the unanswered prayer does to the way you read the answers God gives to others around you. Before living through your own extended season of unanswered prayer, the answered prayers of the people around you were relatively neutral information. You could celebrate them without complexity, could witness someone else receive what they asked for, and feel genuinely glad on their behalf. After living through your own extended season of silence, those same answered prayers become more complicated to receive. Not because you have become a person who cannot celebrate others, but because each answered prayer you witness carries an implicit comparison to the silence you are living with. Each testimony of divine response becomes involuntarily a question about your own situation. Why them and not yet me? What do they have or do or understand that produces a response I have not been able to produce in the same season of asking? And that question, posed silently and involuntarily, every time you witness someone else receive what you have been asking for, produces a fatigue that goes beyond the physical, an emotional and spiritual exhaustion that is compounded by the fact that it cannot be easily expressed without sounding like something it is not, without sounding like jealousy or ingratitude or weakness of faith, so you carry it quietly. And the quietness of the carrying adds its own weight to what is already heavy. You have the right to feel the cost of this. The specific cost of carrying a sincere prayer in prolonged silence is a real cost. It is not the sign of insufficient faith. It is not evidence that something is fundamentally wrong with your relationship with God. It is the honest experience of someone whose investment in what they have asked for is total enough that the delay of its manifestation is felt in every layer of their interior life. That depth of investment, that capacity to keep bringing the same sincere request before God across many seasons of silence, is itself a form of faith that is rarer and more costly than the faith that receives a quick answer and moves on. There is also something the unanswered prayer does in your relationship with the specific thing you have been asking for, because a prayer that has been carried for a long time without answer does not stay static in your interior life. It shifts, it changes shape. The original desire was clear and specific and relatively uncomplicated. Over time, over many seasons of silence surrounding the same request, the desire begins to accumulate layers. Layers of interpretation, layers of doubt about whether the desire itself is right, layers of questioning about whether God's silence means that what you asked for is not what He has planned for you, layers of wondering whether you should still be asking for this specific thing or whether the prolonged silence is itself the answer, and navigating those layers, deciding what the silence means and what it does not mean. Holding the original desire with integrity while remaining open to the possibility that God's answer might look different from what you imagined, is one of the most spiritually demanding interior tasks that the life of faith can require. And then there is the dimension of this wound that touches your capacity to hope without protecting yourself from the hope itself. Because hope that has been extended across a long period without confirmation begins to cost something that simple faith does not cost. It requires a daily decision to remain open to a possibility that the evidence around you does not confirm. A daily choice to invest emotionally and spiritually in an outcome that the visible circumstances give you no reason to count on. And that daily decision, made in the absence of confirmation and in the presence of silence, is one of the most quietly heroic acts that the spiritual life asks of someone who is carrying an unanswered prayer. Here is the truth that God wants to place in the deepest layer of your understanding today. Your unanswered prayer is not evidence that God is withholding from you. It is evidence that God is protecting what He is building for you. And what He is building in the silence between your prayer and its manifestation is something your enemies cannot reach. something that a premature answer would have compromised before it was ready to be received and carried and stewarded the way its significance requires. Consider what happened with Hannah in the first book of Samuel. This woman carried a prayer for a child that had gone unanswered for years, long enough that the pain of it was visible to the people around her, long enough that the high priest Eli initially misread her intensity in prayer as intoxication rather than desperation, long enough that she had developed what the text describes as bitterness of soul, not weak faith, not insufficient desire, but the honest bitterness of someone who had been carrying something real and painful without receiving an answer for a duration that had become genuinely costly. And in 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 27, Hannah says after the answer finally came, "For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him." The answer came, not on Hannah's timeline, not on the schedule that her pain would have chosen, but at the exact moment when what God was building in and around her situation was ready to produce what the answer required. Here is the first truth I want to anchor in your understanding. The timing of God's answer is never arbitrary. It is always precisely calibrated to the moment when two things are simultaneously true. When what is being given is ready to be received, and when the person who is receiving it is ready to carry it with the depth and the wisdom and the capacity that its significance requires. Hannah's son was not just any child. He was Samuel, one of the most significant prophets in the history of Israel, a man whose spiritual discernment and whose influence over the destiny of a nation required a mother who had been formed by the specific depth of longing and faith and patience that only years of unanswered prayer could have produced. The delay was not cruelty, it was calibration. The precise alignment of a person with a purpose that required exactly that preparation to be fulfilled in the way God intended. In Psalm 37 verse 4, the promise is written with a precision that is easy to read quickly and easy to miss the weight of. Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. Not the desires you manufacture, not the desires you have convinced yourself you should want. The desires of your heart, the real ones, the ones that have been living in you long enough to have proven they are not passing impulses but genuine longings that persist across seasons. God knows those desires. He placed them there. And the promise is that He will give them, not that He will give something vaguely adjacent to them. He will give them at the right time, when the giving can be received in the fullness of what the desire was always pointing toward. Here is the second truth. What your enemies interpreted as God's silence toward you was actually God's strategic positioning on your behalf. Every unanswered prayer kept you in a place of dependence and depth, and seeking that a quick answer would have ended. And that place of dependence, that sustained posture of someone who keeps bringing a real need before a God who seems slow to respond, is a posture that builds something in you that answered prayer cannot build. A knowledge of God that goes deeper than the knowledge available to those whose prayers are answered quickly. A faith that has been proven across seasons of silence to be something more than fair-weather trust. A character that has been formed by the specific friction of sustained hope in the absence of visible confirmation. John Bunyan wrote Pilgrim's Progress in prison. 12 years of imprisonment that had no visible justification in the economy of a God who could have opened those prison doors at any moment. And what he wrote in that imprisonment became one of the most widely read spiritual texts in the history of Christianity. The silence of God around his freedom produced something in the silence that the freedom would have prevented. Your unanswered prayers have been producing something in the silence that the answers would have prevented. And that something is of a value and a permanence that cannot be measured from inside the silence but will be fully visible on the other side of it. Here is the third truth. The answer is coming. And when it comes, it will be so precisely calibrated to what has been built in you through the waiting that you will understand in a single moment what the waiting was for. In Isaiah 30 verse 18, God says, "Therefore the Lord waits to be gracious to you, and therefore He exalts Himself to show mercy to you. For the Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are all those who wait for Him." The Lord waits, not indifferently, not because He forgot, but because his grace toward you is too precise to be given before the moment when it can be fully received. He is waiting for the right moment to be gracious, and that moment, exactly calibrated to what has been built and to who you have become in the building, is closer than the silence suggests. Chosen. My question for you today is this: if you could genuinely receive your most persistent unanswered prayer, not as evidence of God's distance, but as the specific place where He is doing His most precise work in your life, how would you carry that prayer differently from this moment forward? Let that question find the places in you where the silence has been heaviest, because those are the places where what God is building is most significant. Let me show you with precision what someone looks like who has genuinely understood the divine purpose behind their unanswered prayers, who has stopped reading the silence as evidence against them and has begun to receive it as confirmation that what God is building is too significant to be rushed. The first transformation is in the quality of their prayer itself. Before this understanding, prayer under prolonged silence tends to become increasingly focused on the specific outcome being requested. The prayer narrows. It becomes almost entirely about the thing being asked for, and about the reasons God should provide it, and about the faith being demonstrated in the asking. The request dominates the prayer to the point where the relationship itself, the actual encounter with God, that prayer is designed to produce, becomes secondary to the petition. The prayer becomes a transaction rather than a conversation, a request rather than a meeting. After this understanding settles in, something fundamental changes in the nature of the prayer. It does not stop asking for what it has been asking for, but the asking is no longer the whole of the prayer. There is room now for something else, for a quality of presence in the prayer that the urgency of the unanswered petition had crowded out, a capacity to simply be with God in the silence rather than continually filling the silence with the same request. And in that spaciousness, in that quality of being present with God, beyond the specific petition, something becomes available that the petition-focused prayer had made inaccessible: a depth of encounter, a quality of intimacy, a knowledge of God that is only available to those who have stayed in the prayer long enough for it to become something more than a transaction. The second transformation is in their relationship with the specific thing they have been asking for. Before this understanding, the unanswered prayer tends to produce one of two things in the person carrying it: either an increasing grip on the desired outcome, a tightening of the hold on what has been asked for, a growing desperation that makes the desire itself harder and harder to hold without distortion, or a progressive resignation, a slow loosening of the grip that is not genuine release but surrender by exhaustion, a giving up that feels like trust but is actually the fatigue of someone who has stopped being able to sustain the hope. After this understanding, a third option becomes available that neither the grip nor the resignation could produce: a genuine holding of the desire in open hands. Not the forced open hands of someone who has been told they should surrender but is still internally clutching, but the genuinely open hands of someone who has understood that what God gives is always better than what they would have given themselves, and always arrives at a moment that produces more than an earlier arrival would have produced. This genuine openness, this quality of holding the desire without either clutching or abandoning it, is one of the most spiritually mature postures available to a person of faith. And it can only develop in someone who has carried a sincere unanswered prayer long enough to have learned through the carrying what faith in God's timing actually costs and what it actually produces. The third transformation is in their capacity to be present with others who are carrying their own unanswered prayers. Because someone who has lived inside the specific experience of prolonged silence around a sincere request, who knows the texture of that silence from the inside rather than from the outside, possesses a quality of presence with others in similar seasons that no one else can offer. Not the presence of someone who has a theological framework for why God allows unanswered prayer and who can explain it clearly and helpfully, but the presence of someone who has been in the silence, who knows what it costs to keep bringing the same prayer before a God who seems slow to respond, who can sit with another person in their silence and communicate without words that the silence is not the end of the story. that God is building in it, that what comes after the silence will be worth the full cost of the silence itself. The fourth transformation is in their understanding of what prayer actually is and what it is actually for. Before this understanding, prayer is primarily a mechanism for getting what is needed from God, a spiritual technology for accessing divine provision, an act of faith that produces outcomes proportional to its intensity and sincerity. After this understanding, prayer becomes something fundamentally different. It becomes the primary means by which the relationship between the person and God is deepened to the point where the person begins to know God not as a provider to be accessed, but as a father to be known. And that knowledge, that direct and personal and unmediated knowledge of God that develops in the sustained practice of prayer that includes prolonged seasons of silence, is of a value that exceeds by an infinite margin the value of any specific answer that prayer could have produced on a faster timeline. Chosen. I want to finish with this. Your unanswered prayer is not evidence that God has not heard you. It is not evidence that your faith is insufficient or your relationship with God is blocked, or that what you asked for is outside the scope of what He will give you. It is evidence that God is building something in the space between your prayer and its manifestation that is too significant to be rushed, too precise to be given before the moment when it can be fully received, too valuable to be compromised by an answer that arrives before what the answer requires has been built in you and around you and in the invisible dimensions of your situation. Your enemies have watched the silence and concluded that your prayers do not move God. They were wrong. Your prayers have been moving things in dimensions they cannot see, building things in the invisible that the visible will eventually have to reflect, positioning things in the spiritual realm that will produce visible results at the exact moment when the alignment between what has been built and what is being given is complete and perfect and precisely calibrated to produce what God intended when He placed the desire in you in the first place. Stay in the prayer. Not because it is easy to stay in a prayer that has not yet produced the visible response you have been waiting for. Not because the silence is comfortable or the waiting is without cost, but because the one who placed the desire in you is the same one who is building what the desire is pointing toward. And He is too faithful to place a genuine desire in a sincere heart without having already prepared the answer. He is too precise to give the answer before the moment when the giving can produce everything He intended it to produce. And He is too intentional in His love for you to leave the silence empty. He is filling it with something you will see clearly on the day the answer finally arrives. The silence is not His absence, it is His construction. And what He builds in silence always arrives with a power that what He builds in noise cannot carry. What breaks you open is what lets the light in.